Visually, it's a bit of a misnomer. The picture on the screen at the moment is the Beatles never actually played in Dulwich. My researches reveal that the closest they got, they played shows in Tooting, Croydon and Lewisham. I think we've got a poster of one of the shows they did nearby. And I think it's interesting if you look at the poster with it was the ABC Croydon they actually played at, and there we go. Look at that bill. Chris Montez, America's exciting Chris Montez, America's fabulous Tommy Rowe, and at the very bottom, Britain's dynamic Beatles. But look at those prices: 8 and 6, 7 shillings, 5 and 6, 2 shows a night as well. I did get to see the second best group that came out of Liverpool, the Searchers, at Tooting. And on the bill making her solo debut was Dusty Springfield. And I remember the beehive hair and this stunning pink dress she was wearing. And I thought, I like Dusty Springfield. I think I'll marry her. But it was never to be, unfortunately. I did get to see the Beatles in East Dulwich, not in person, but when A Hard Day's Night played at the old and still much missed East Dulwich Odeon. And I said I saw them because you couldn't actually hear anything. The screaming was just unbelievable. Girls were just screaming their heads off at a film. It was extraordinary. And I mean, I think people forget that tsunami of Beatlemania. I mean, it really was mania, hysteria from the big freeze in January '63, and then She Loves You was that summer, and then that just carried on until Christmas, when everybody got their Beatle Christmas LPs and their Beatle Christmas records. They used to make little flimsy records saying, "Hello, it's the Beatles here. This is John speaking with his voice," and it was fantastic. Paul and Linda's first daughter, Mary, was born at King's College Hospital in Camberwell, just down the road. So there is a slight Dulwich connection. When I met McCartney once, and I know that 3 of the Beatles went to see Bob Dylan at the Isle of Wight. And I said, why didn't you go? And he said, well, our first daughter was being born. I thought I knew where my priorities lay. So, okay. I let him get away with it. Alas, I couldn't think of a link to Dulwich and Bob Dylan, apart from the fact that the great man did play at the Brixton Academy. I think more than once, actually. I saw him there. But this is a good day to be doing this, the 4th of October, because 60 years ago, Stockwell-born Roger Moore made his TV debut as the Saint this week in 1962. But it was also tomorrow, I think 60 years ago, is the day that you can carbon date the beginning of the swinging 60s, because a new magazine called New Society was being launched. IPC launched it to chart the changes of the forthcoming decade. They knew something was happening. And so New Society magazine was launched 5th of October 1962. The first James Bond film, which you see on the poster, was premiered, and the very first Beatles single, Love Me Do, was released. So in that one day, in that 24-hour period, just quarter of a mile around the West End, you had the first James Bond film still going strong, and the Beatles effectively still going strong as well. The Dulwich connection to music, Dulwich College connection to music, is best known for the man in the funny glasses. Philip Target Adams was a pupil at Dulwich College. He was a few years older than me. But he thought that his mother's maiden name was a bit more rock and roll, so he changed it to Phil Manzanera, long-serving guitarist with Roxy Music, who celebrate their 50th anniversary this year. It was while he was at Dulwich that Phil was in a group called Quiet Sun that featured Bill McCormick on bass and Charles Hayward on drums. I noticed that Charles Hayward is actually playing the South Bank on the 16th of October. I'm afraid that musically for me, Hayward went a bit wayward. It was a bit avant-garde for me, but not surprisingly, as in an interview to promote the show, he said that his music was definitely not from Southeast London. Bill went on to play with Robert Wyatt's group Matching Molds, a group he formed after Soft Machine, and Random Hold, which is a school group. No, there was pupils from Dulwich were in, including our dear friend David Ferguson, the late David Ferguson, and guitarist David Rhodes, who went on to become Peter Gabriel's long-serving guitarist. Whenever Gabriel breaks cover, David Rhodes is always there. Another pupil at the school was Ian MacDonald, and not a musician, but probably more influential, that he went on to edit the New Musical Express during the glory days. And I mean, this really was a time when the weekly music press was all powerful. I mean, NME, Melody Maker, Record Mirror, Sounds, Disc and Music Echo, five weekly music papers every single week. I answered an ad in 1976, hard to believe now, but to be a hip young gunslinger, and began freelancing on the NME. And I was delighted to learn later that Nick Hornby, Neil Tennant and Sebastian Fawkes had applied to become hip young gunslingers, but that pleasure had been denied them. So that's one up on them. Ian died far too early and wrote one of the most acclaimed books on the Beatles, Revolutions in the Head, still in print, still well worth reading. And at his death was working on what would have been an absolutely compelling volume, a similar study of the life and work of David Bowie. The other Dulwich connection that's worth mentioning is that pop trio Right Said Fred remembered, if at all, for their I'm Too Sexy hit, took their name not from the Bernard Cribbins hit record, but from a short story by old Elenian P.G. Woodhouse. Found my Roxy Music first album on Island Records, looking out for this, and I was wondering where I got it, and I'm pretty convinced it came from, and people, local viewers might well remember, F.J. Graham's in Herne Hill. It was, I think, where the Vets is now on Roughton Road, and you used to get your, so I remember getting singles there, and then odd LPs, sometimes as much as 32 and 6, you'd splash out on LPs. Then, and I think Mr. Cormack will remember, Harriman's on Half Moon Lane, which was half furniture store and half record store, and that's where when I grew up, when I got to about 16, I go and buy LPs of Procol Harum and Simon and Garfunkel, most of which I still have, although some of them are now on the newfangled compact disc format. There's a good Southeast London connection to Pink Floyd. The legendary band's first photo session took place in Camberwell's Ruskin Park in 1967. And Camberwell, of course, also features, apparently Mark Knopfler used to live on Camberwell Road, and Florence and Machine was born there. Pink Floyd, as we see, went on to play at the Crystal Palace Bowl in 1971, 15th of May, 1971. Once again, those eye-watering ticket prices, £1.25. The crowd was delighted to see the lake in front of the bowl. This sea monster, inflatable sea monster, came out, which was not a high point of the show. I think it would have been doing Atom Heart Mother, I think, at the time. Between 1971 and 1980, the bowl played host to a number of classic acts. Elton John, Yes, Santana, the Beach Boys, and Bob Marley on what proved to be his last ever UK appearance. And delighted to see that there's music coming back to Crystal Palace Bowl now. I mean, I've never heard of any of the people, but I mean, in the glory days, it was the place to be seen. Yeah, I mean, well, Coldplay I've heard of. Interestingly, the Marley gig, Chris Blackwell, who was the label boss at Island Records, was also a close friend of Marley's. He was being driven to Crystal Palace, and somebody in the car, probably not the chauffeur, probably an A&R guy, said, "Oh, you know, on the way to Crystal Palace, you should stop off in Herne Hill. There's a young Irish band playing who I've heard good things about." So Chris Blackwell popped into the Half Moon Herne Hill and went to see a group making only their second ever appearance in the UK, which was U2, and you can see July the 11th. And in the U2 concert file, they call the 11th of July 1980 gig at the Half Moon Herne Hill a landmark, as it's the first time they'd sold out a concert in the United Kingdom. So extraordinary to think that one of the world's biggest bands began at the Half Moon. Well, they did the Clarendon Hammersmith before, that's demolished. The Half Moon's still going strong, I'm delighted to say. So they went on to, well, to great things. The pub still going strong, Fuller's Pub now, very nice it is too. Another strong musical connection. Former manager of the pub, which you see here, was Frank Sinatra's chauffeur when Frank was appearing in London. He would insist on being driven around by this guy. Now Frank's former wife, Mia Farrow, you can see in the picture there. There's a picture of her having a pint, or like half a pint actually, in the Half Moon. I think just after she'd done Rosemary's Baby. So she certainly went there. There must have been a reason for her to go there. So I'm assuming the connection was her former husband. Now, the rumor is that if you'd gone to the Half Moon one evening, you might have heard old Blue Eyes popping in for a pint and giving us a song. Now, I think it's pretty unlikely, but I do remember the Half Moon. If you go in now, the right-hand door, and towards the end there was a stage, and Sunday lunchtimes they used to give out free seafood, which was really salty to make you drink more. And they used to have groups playing, or people to get up and sing. So it's possible, dooby-dooby-doo, I think possible but unlikely. A very dear friend of mine, the late and great Fred Della, was president of the Frank Sinatra Appreciation Society. And Frank only ever recorded one album outside of North America. In 1962, Sinatra sings great songs of Great Britain. As the title suggests, he cherry-picked his favourite songs from this sceptred isle. And Fred was at the recording session. He was actually there when Frank was recording, and he said the rapport between Sinatra and the musicians, he said, was really impressive. And he said what impressed him was that every time one of the musicians made a mistake, he flubbed a note or got something wrong, Sinatra would stop the session and say, "I'm sorry, I think I got that wrong." He would always take the blame. He'd never blame the musicians, which I think shows a decency that you don't often hear about Frank Sinatra. Apparently when Sinatra was told he was doing this album of duets with people like, Aretha Franklin and Tony Bennett and Charles Aznavour, he said, and also we've got Bono on the album. And Sinatra said, "Well, I'm not singing with goddamn Sonny Bono." And they pointed out, no, he's the singer with the biggest rock band on the planet. So that pacified him a bit. Just over the road from the Half Moon, just before we leave the Half Moon, the Police, I believe, certainly played there. A lot of the two-tone bands used to use it as a rehearsal space. Van Morrison apparently either did a warm-up gig or rehearsed there. It's a pub with a good musical pedigree. Just over the road from the Half Moon in Brockwell Park, on the 24th of September 1978, Elvis Costello in a lurid pink jacket headlined a Rock Against Racism gig. The movement that begun in 1976 following on-stage announcements from a very, very drunk Eric Clapton, supporting Enoch Powell, banging on about immigration, completely uncalled for. So Rock Against Racism was formed that day in September. They met at Trafalgar Square and marched to Brockwell Park, where, as you can see, it was Elvis headlining, but Sham 69, Misty, Aswad, various reggae groups, and I didn't get to that gig. I did go and see the Clash at an earlier Rock Against Racism gig in April that year. The crowds at Brockwell Park, estimates vary from 50,000 to 150,000. But it's good to see it back in use. Madness, of course, played there in June earlier this year. So Brockwell Park comes back on the musical radar. I think of all the Southeast London musical connections, the strongest is that of the artist formerly known as David Jones. David Bowie was born in Stansfield Road in Brixton in 1947, where he lived until he was 6. The family then moved to Plaistow Grove in Bromley, and then he moved to Haddon Hall, which you can see at the bottom there on the right. Beautiful building, long demolished in Beckenham. Don't know why it was demolished. Fantastic looking Victorian sort of folly. And it was in Beckenham that Bowie hatched his plans for Superstar. And I find it just extraordinary to think that, you know, Major Tom took off from Beckenham in Space Oddity. It's where Ziggy Stardust was formulated, Aladdin Sane, all these characters. And then following Ziggy, when Bowie 73, 74 was like the biggest star on the planet. Actually, him and Elton maybe neck and neck, but he's huge star, Ziggy Main. Bowie moved to Chelsea. Then he left London behind in the mid-70s, well publicised, lost years in Los Angeles, then on to Switzerland, and finally settled in New York. I believe just before his death, he brought his wife and daughter back to show them his old South London roots, and he went back to Stansfield Road and Beckenham. And there's an interview he did, I think not long before he died. Somebody said, is there anything you miss? And Bowie said, yes, the night bus from Penge. I used to see him at the Beckenham Arts Lab, which was the 3 Tons pub, the grandly named Beckenham Arts Lab, back room of the pub. And it's now a Zizzy restaurant. And my dear wife Sue suggested if they had any sense, they'd have a pizza on there called Zizzy Stardust. It would make perfect sense, but as yet they haven't quite realised that. I think, I mean, Bowie went on to become this superstar, and I mean, frankly, I think after Let's Dance, there's not a lot of musical muscle that most people would recognise. But in 1993, he did a great soundtrack to the TV series Buddha of Suburbia. And it reconnected him to the suburbs he thought he'd long left behind. And I think many people, i.e. me, actually some other critics, do believe it's one of the best things he ever did. Very underrated album. If you get a chance to hear it, Buddha of Suburbia, the David Bowie album, is great. And as somebody said, you know, you can take the boy out of the suburbs, but you can't take the suburbs out of the boy. Now, the Bowie track I thought we'd play was not an obvious one. Well, Space Odyssey was going to be there, and another urban myth, along with Frank playing the Half Moon, was that David was born in Brixton, and so was John Major, the Prime Minister, ex-Prime Minister, and John Major's father was a musical artist called Tom Major. And the idea is that the 6-year-old David Bowie would have gone around Brixton and seen posters for Tom Major, and then 25 years later thought, oh, what about if I turn it around and he becomes Major Tom? But that was a bit too obvious. So what I've done is I've gone for a track from his first really proper album, which was, well, it's Space Oddity, it's David Bowie, whichever version you bought. But it's Memory of a Free Festival. And it was the last song on the album. And he wrote it about the Beckenham Growth Summer Festival and Free Concert, 16th of August 1969, that you can see there. But it's interesting, I say it's not one of his better known songs, but it's the song that they chose to end the Bowie documentary Moon Age Daydream, which I saw at the East Dulwich Picture House last week. Took up most of last week, actually. It's a very long film, but they chose that to end it on, which is nice. I met Bowie, well, I saw it at the 3 Tons. Thought he showed promise. Bit too much Jacques Brel, but no, that's his call. I was doing a radio show with Nicky Horn on Sunday afternoons in London, and normally there'd be me and Nicky Horn and the engineer and the producer. And then they said David Bowie's coming in, so suddenly the world and his mother turned up. He couldn't get in the door, but I knew he was going to be there. So I cleverly took along a copy of my Nick Drake biography and presented it to him. They said, "Oh, yeah, Nick, I never saw him, but John Remborn, got Yanch, David Graham. You remember those people on the folk circuit?" And I fortuitously, you won't be able to see it, but I took along my Hunky Dory, his best album, got him to sign that. And I thought, well, you know, you have 10 minutes with him before he goes and see. What do you say to David Bowie? I mean, you know, you are the single most influential British rock musician ever. Well, I mean, he knows that. You know, he knows. Ziggy Stardust was a very influential record. I mean, he gets that too. I mean, he hears this every day. So I said, at the time I was living in Chaucer Road in Brixton, not far from Stansfield Road. Did he ever go back to Stansfield Road? And he said, well, he'd driven past a number of times. He'd never actually gone in, but his abiding memories, he said he remembered there's a yellow rayon tablecloth. There was, and he got his parents, like so many, got their first television for the coronation in 1953. And he said he watched that and he remembered being terrified by Quatermass and the Pit, watching that in Brixton. And the other memory I have of Bowie is that he laughed a lot. I mean, he just laughed like a dray all the time. But it was a lovely meeting, actually. In the pre-rock and roll era, Dulwich resident Anne Shelton, 1923 to 1994, was fondly remembered. As a teenager, she began singing on BBC Radio and performed alongside Bing Crosby and Glenn Miller, along with Vera Lynn, and was the Forces' sweetheart. She was a wartime favourite. After the war, she got a foothold on the American charts, and in 1956 enjoyed a UK #1 with her signature song, Lay Down Your Arms. He was a long-time resident of Court Lane, and her house now has a plaque honouring her. Talking to Sharon earlier, she reminded me of another musical titan of local connection, Michael Crawford. Used to live in Stradella Road, rumoured to be where Boris Johnson may be moving to. Michael Crawford's dad managed David Gregg's in Herne Hill, which is now the Peachy Goat. The musical connection, Michael Crawford was the original Phantom of the Opera in the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, but also he was there filming How I Won the War in Spain in 1966 with John Lennon, and he remembered John Lennon writing Strawberry Fields Forever. So that's pretty cool. Another Dulwich resident was Brixton born, Jess Conrad. Now, Jess enjoyed considerable UK success in the early 60s as a singer. His Mystery Girls, a top 20 hit in 1961, sadly, he's probably best remembered for This Pullover, which was voted one of the world's worst records in the Capital Radio poll. And like so many of the solo singers of that era, his career was overturned by the arrival of the Beatles. You know, it wasn't just Jess Conrad, Billy Fury and Adam Faith and Mark Winter and Ethan Kane, Craig Douglas. It was all these singers. When the Beatles came, when that wave of Beatlemania hit in 1963, the writing was on the wall. And the book that I've been writing since lockdown, called With the Beatles, still looking for an agent, still looking for a publisher. If there's any out there, you can get me on my website. I make the point in there that one of the reasons for the Beatles' breakthrough, and I think their greatness, was that they arrived writing their own songs. They didn't need Tin Pan Alley. They didn't need to rely on cover versions of American hits. They could do it all themselves. And they also had Brian Epstein as their manager. Now, we know that Brian Epstein was not the world's greatest manager. He lost them millions and millions and millions of dollars in merchandising on the American market. When they toured America for the first time in 1964, this company came to him and said, "We're going to make Beatle t-shirts, Beatle wigs, Beatle lunchboxes, and you will get 10% of everyone we sell." And he went, "Oh, wow," you know, he was really impressed. They got 90%. He was a furniture salesman from Liverpool. What did he know? He didn't know he was handling the biggest entertainment phenomenon of the 20th century. He did get them out of playing the Notting Ash Village Hall. He got them to London. He got them a recording deal. That alone, Brian Epstein deserves credit. And I was delighted to see recently there's a statue, a very good one actually, been unveiled to him in Liverpool. And when he got them to London, he got them to EMI, and they didn't get Norrie Paramore or Ron Richards or any of those producers. They got George Martin. And George Martin had the ears to sense there was something potentially great there. So when John would go to him and say, I want this song to sound like 10,000 Buddhist monks chanting on a mountaintop, George Martin would say, well, just give me a minute, John, I'll see what I can do, see if I can rustle something out. I was very lucky I missed John when I was on Melody Maker by about a couple of months. He was due to come back and make a private visit in 1981, which of course he never did because some person shot him. But I did spend a lot of time in the 90s with Paul McCartney in my short-lived career as a PR. And he was always very focused on what he was promoting, you know, his new album, his new single, whatever it was. And he rarely talked about the Beatles, but one day, and I think he'd been on the old Bob Hope, because he suddenly got chatting about the Beatles. And I think I used to have these very NHS John Lennon glasses. And I thought one of John's great contributions to British culture was he made the wearing of NHS glasses cool. And I think something clicked in Paul, and he started explaining about writing songs with John, and he started playing the table in front of me, saying, and I got, hey Jude, I did, and then I got to the line, the movement you need is on your shoulder. And I said to John, that's always a filler line. He said, I remember John putting his glasses down, that's line in the song, man. So we kept it. And he said he always had trouble finding, he could do melodies off the top of his head. He always had a struggle getting lyrics to match the melody. And I hear myself on the interview saying, well, I don't know, Paul, actually. I mean, Yesterday is a pretty good combination of lyric and melody. And you go back and find it's the most recorded song in the history of popular music. There are over 3,000 cover versions of Yesterday by Paul McCartney. So I'm glad to see that he took my advice and didn't give up. And on the way out the studio, there was this big old-fashioned double bass in the corner. And I thought, that's nice, you know, one of yours. He said, yeah, Linda bought it for me. It's double bass that Bill Black played on Heartbreak Hotel by Elvis. Sorry, yeah, pretty cool. You know, not half. And he picked it up, and if you're left-handed, how would you play? Paul McCartney started playing the riff from Heartbreak Hotel, and I thought my work here is done. It doesn't get much better than that, actually. The picture you see here of popular beat group, the Beatles, the last ever photo session as a group. It's taken at John's Tittenhurst Park mansion, 1969. Last time they ever were photographed together as a group. And they were doing Abbey Road. And you think of that arc from Love Me Do in 1962. In 7 years, they went from that via Sgt. Pepper, The White Album, Revolver, to Abbey Road. It's incredible. It's an incredible story. Yeah, the Beatles. What can you say? I never got to see them live. But I think, as I said I thought when I saw Paul, my work here is done. Thank you very much for listening.